Rejected by everyone, the abandoned ship is transformed into the greatest by a human mechanic. Its paint was peeling, the metal was corroded, and its wooden deck creaked under the wind. The townspeople had given it a name long ago, the Seafarer's Pride, but now it was just known as the abandoned ship. Everyone avoided it. Children whispered stories about its haunted past, fishermen laughed at it as they passed, and merchants shook their heads whenever it came up in conversation. The ship had been rejected by every shipping company, deemed too old, too damaged, and too expensive to repair. It seemed that no one wanted it, but there was one man who saw something different. Ethan, a mechanic in his early 30s, was walking along the dock that morning. He wore a worn leather jacket, his hands stained with grease from a morning job, and his eyes were sharp, observant. Unlike the townspeople who only saw rust and failure, Ethan saw possibilities. He saw the faint outlines of what the ship could become if it were given care and attention. He stopped in front of it, running his hand along the rusted railing. The metal was cold and rough, but to him it spoke. Ethan had always been different. He didn't care much for what others thought. While people in the town settled for easy jobs and small lives, Ethan loved to fix things. Cars, engines, broken tools, even old appliances. He could make almost anything work again. Some people called him stubborn, but Ethan called it determination. He had learned long ago that most people gave up too quickly. If you were willing to work hard and think creatively, nothing was truly beyond repair. And now, standing in front of the abandoned ship, he felt that familiar spark of excitement he always felt when starting a big project. For weeks, he had been thinking about the ship. He had watched it from the cafe where he had breakfast, from the road he took to the mechanic shop, and even from the small hill that overlooked the harbor. Every time he looked at it, he imagined what it could be, a strong, powerful ship, ready to sail the seas again, carrying goods and people. But he knew it would not be easy. The ship had been left alone for years. Its engines were destroyed, the hull had holes, the wiring was gone, and the wood was weak. Any attempt to repair it would require patience, skill, and imagination. Most people would have walked away just as everyone else had done, but not Ethan. He took a deep breath and started walking along the side of the ship, inspecting every part he could reach. The deck was slippery with moss, and the ropes hung loose and frayed. The anchor, once heavy and polished, was rusted through. The cabins were dark and smelled of damp wood and old metal. Windows were broken, and the ship's name, painted in bold letters years ago, was barely visible under layers of grime. It was easy to see why no one wanted it, but Ethan didn't think of it as trash. He thought of it as a challenge, a puzzle waiting to be solved. The dock owner, a tall man named Mr. Harris, came walking toward him. He raised an eyebrow when he saw Ethan inspecting the ship so closely. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" Mr. Harris asked. His voice was deep, a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. Ethan smiled. I want to fix it," he said simply. Mr. Harris shook his head slowly. "You know what people say, Ethan, that ship is a lost cause. It's been rejected by everyone, and for good reason. It will take months, maybe years, to even get it back in shape. Most people would never see it through." "I'm not most people," Ethan replied. His voice was calm but full of conviction. "I can do it. I just need your permission to start." The dock owner studied him for a long moment. He had seen Ethan work before, fixing engines, restoring old boats, and even repairing machinery that others had given up on. He knew Ethan's reputation. Still, this was a bigger project than anything Ethan had attempted before. He could feel the weight of the decision. Finally, he nodded. "All right," he said. "You can have the ship, but don't come crying to me when it falls apart." Ethan laughed, though it was a quiet, determined laugh. "I won't, I promise." And with that, he began the work. The first days were slow and exhausting. Ethan spent hours just walking the deck, taking notes, and making lists of everything that needed attention. He had no budget for fancy equipment or new parts, so he had to think creatively. He made sketches, measured parts carefully, and started gathering materials he could reuse. Each small discovery was a victory. A cracked pipe might be repaired. A broken railing might be replaced. Even a rusty bolt could be polished and reused. Every tiny improvement made him feel closer to his goal. The townspeople watched him with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. Some called him crazy. "Why waste your time on that old thing?" they asked. Others simply shook their heads and went about their day. But Ethan didn't care. Each morning he arrived at the dock before the sun rose, and each evening he left only when the last light faded from the water. He worked tirelessly, often covered in grease and sweat, but always with a sense of purpose. One afternoon, as a storm approached, Ethan climbed to the top of the ship's deck to check the rigging. The wind was strong, and the rain began to fall in heavy sheets. The ship groaned and creaked under the weight of the storm, but Ethan held firm. He secured ropes, checked for leaks, and made sure the ship would survive the night. As he worked, he realized something important. The ship was teaching him patience. It would not be fixed quickly. Every step forward required thought, care, and respect for the work. The ship demanded effort, but it also gave him a sense of purpose he had never felt before. That night, after the storm passed, Ethan sat on the dock and looked at the ship. Water dripped from the edges, and the air smelled of salt and rain, but he felt a quiet pride. He had started something that no one else believed in, and even though the ship was far from finished, it already felt alive again. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Ethan learned more about the ship than he had ever imagined. He discovered old blueprints hidden in a drawer, pieces of machinery that had been buried under layers of rust, and notes from the original builders. Each discovery was a story, a connection to the past. It made his work more meaningful. He wasn't just fixing a ship. He was preserving history, bringing something lost back into the world. He also faced many challenges. Tools broke, parts were impossible to find, and sometimes his own strength and patience were tested. Friends and neighbors would stop by, offering advice or criticism, but Ethan stayed focused. He found joy in solving problems, in finding new ways to make old parts work. He often stayed late into the night, his workshop illuminated by a single lamp, his hands moving quickly as he worked. One evening, a group of children came to the dock, curious about what he was doing. They peeked over the railing, whispering to each other. Ethan smiled and waved at them. "Don't worry," he called. "This ship will sail again one day, you'll see." The children's eyes widened. They had grown up hearing stories about the abandoned ship, stories of failure and disappointment. But here was someone who believed it could be more. Ethan realized that his work was not just about fixing metal and wood. It was about inspiring hope, about showing that even things that seem lost can be restored with effort and care. As the sun set each day, Ethan would sit on the ship's deck looking out at the water. He imagined the ship cutting through waves, strong and proud. He imagined the people it could carry, the goods it could deliver, the journeys it could take. Every vision gave him strength for the next day, another step closer to making the impossible possible. Though the ship was still abandoned by everyone else, Ethan was beginning to see it in a new light. It was not a failure, not a relic of the past. It was a challenge, a friend, and a project full of potential. And for the first time in years, he felt truly alive, filled with purpose and determination. Ethan's journey with the abandoned ship was only beginning. But in that quiet coastal town, amid rust and decay, something extraordinary was starting to take shape. A ship rejected by everyone was slowly finding life again, guided by the hands of a man who refused to give up. And as the first stars appeared in the night sky, Ethan whispered to the ship, as if it could hear him, "We're going to show them all. You're going to be great again." Ethan woke up early the next morning before the sun had even begun to rise. The sky was still dark, and the only sounds were the gentle lapping of waves against the dock and the distant cry of seagulls. He ate a quick breakfast and walked to the abandoned ship, determination written clearly on his face. Today, he told himself, he would begin the real work. The inspection and imagining had been necessary, but now it was time for action. The first step was to examine the ship's engines. They were old, covered in rust and layers of grime, and many parts were missing. He opened the engine room doors carefully, the hinges creaking loudly as if protesting his intrusion. Inside, the smell of oil, salt, and decay was strong. The machinery groaned under its own weight, a reminder of years of neglect. Ethan ran his hands over the cold metal, feeling the textures and noting the weak points. He made a mental map of what needed attention: pipes, belts, motors, and the fuel system, all worn and damaged. Ethan knew he could not simply replace everything. He did not have the money for new parts, and some components were impossible to find. So he started thinking creatively. He examined each piece carefully, considering which parts could be repaired and which ones could be rebuilt. Sometimes he took apart old engines from his workshop or salvaged pieces from other abandoned machinery to create what he needed. Each step was like solving a puzzle, and Ethan loved puzzles. While working on the engines, Ethan encountered his first major challenge. One of the main pistons was cracked and corroded. It seemed impossible to repair. For a moment he stepped back, frustration and doubt creeping in. Could he really fix this ship? Was it too far gone? He took a deep breath, wiped the sweat from his brow, and reminded himself of the reason he had started this project. This ship had potential, and he would not give up. Using a combination of welding, reshaping, and reinforced materials from other machinery, he managed to repair the piston. It was far from perfect, but it worked. A small smile appeared on his face. One victory, no matter how small, was still a victory. As the days passed, Ethan made slow but steady progress. He replaced broken valves, repaired corroded pipes, and cleaned the engines until they looked almost new. The work was exhausting, but every improvement motivated him to continue. The ship was starting to respond to his efforts. Where it had once groaned and creaked loudly, there was now a sense of strength and stability returning. Each repaired section seemed to breathe new life into the vessel. Ethan also worked on the hull. Years of exposure to salt water had left it covered in rust, with holes and weak spots in several areas. He spent hours sanding, patching, and reinforcing the metal, sometimes working in the hot sun, sometimes in the rain. Neighbors would sometimes pass by and watch, shaking their heads in disbelief. "You're wasting your time," some would say. "No one can fix that ship." But Ethan didn't listen. Each patch he applied, each layer of protective paint made him feel closer to his goal. The ship's wooden decks were another challenge. Some planks were rotted and dangerous to walk on. Ethan removed the worst pieces and replaced them with wood he had carefully selected and treated. He worked slowly, making sure each plank was secure. Walking across the deck became easier with each improvement, and for the first time the ship felt safe. He imagined sailors walking on it again, and the thought filled him with pride. Even small details mattered to Ethan. He fixed broken windows, polished the railings, and repaired the ropes and rigging. These tasks might have seemed minor to others, but he knew that attention to detail was what would make the ship truly great. Every rope he mended, every bolt he tightened, and every piece of wood he replaced brought him closer to transforming the abandoned ship into something remarkable. One evening, after weeks of work, Ethan paused to admire his progress. The ship looked different now. It still bore the marks of its years of neglect, but there was a sense of potential in its appearance. The engines were functional, the deck was safe, and the hull was strong. The ship seemed to shine faintly in the evening light, as if acknowledging his effort. Ethan felt a surge of determination. If he could bring it this far, he could finish what he had started. Challenges continued to arise. One day, while testing a repaired section of the hull, a hidden weak spot gave way, allowing water to seep in. Ethan was frustrated, but he didn't panic. He quickly sealed the leak and reinforced the area with stronger materials. Each problem taught him something new, and each solution brought him closer to mastery. He began to feel a deeper connection with the ship, almost as if it were a living entity, responding to his care and skill. The town began to notice his progress. People who had laughed at him initially started to watch more closely, some even stopping to offer encouragement. Children would run to the dock after school to see what Ethan had done that day. Even the fishermen who had once ignored the ship now nodded in respect. While no one fully understood his vision, they could see that he was achieving something extraordinary. Ethan also faced personal struggles during this period. He often felt tired, his hands blistered and sore, and there were moments when the work seemed overwhelming. But he reminded himself why he had started this project. The ship was more than metal and wood. It was a symbol of persistence, hope, and transformation. Every time he felt doubt creeping in, he focused on the small victories, an engine that roared to life, a plank that fit perfectly, a rope that held strong. These small successes fueled him to keep going. One cold morning, a storm swept through the town. Winds howled, waves crashed against the dock, and rain fell in sheets. Ethan braved the storm to secure the ship, checking every rope, every anchor, and every weak spot. The ship groaned and creaked under the force of nature, but it did not break. Ethan felt a deep sense of pride. The ship had endured neglect for years, yet it still stood strong, and now, under his care, it could face even the fiercest challenges. The months continued to pass, and Ethan's progress became more visible. The engines were fully functional, capable of powering the ship across long distances. The hull was reinforced and painted, gleaming in the sun. The deck was smooth and sturdy, and every detail, from railings to ropes, was carefully repaired. The abandoned ship was no longer just a forgotten relic. It was becoming a vessel of strength, resilience, and possibility. Ethan's dedication inspired others in the town. Some young men and women began to volunteer, eager to learn from him and help with the restoration. They sanded, painted, and repaired under his guidance, learning not only technical skills but also the value of patience and persistence. The ship became a project that united the community, and Ethan's work started to change the way people thought about what was possible. Evenings were often the most reflective times for Ethan. Sitting on the deck, watching the sun set over the water, he imagined the ship sailing across the open sea, carrying goods and people, exploring distant ports and surviving storms. These visions gave him energy for the long days ahead. He began to write notes, sketches, and plans for future improvements, thinking not just about repairing the ship, but about transforming it into something extraordinary. One day, a representative from a nearby shipping company came to the dock. They had heard rumors about Ethan's work and wanted to see it for themselves. Walking around the ship, examining the repairs and improvements, they were visibly impressed. While they had once rejected the ship as useless, they now saw its potential. Ethan's skill and determination had turned what everyone had considered a lost cause into a functioning, promising vessel. Despite the praise, Ethan remained focused on the work rather than recognition. He knew there was still much to do, but the progress he had made was undeniable. The ship, once abandoned and rejected, was slowly being transformed into something that could sail proudly once again. By the end of this stage, the engines roared to life, the deck supported every step, and the hull stood strong against waves. Ethan had faced countless challenges, from rust and decay to storms and doubt, yet he had overcome them all. He had learned more than technical skills. He had learned patience, resilience, and the joy of seeing something once forgotten become alive again. Ethan knew the journey was far from over. There were still details to perfect, cabins to restore, and systems to test. But the abandoned ship was no longer a symbol of failure. It was a symbol of what could be achieved with determination, creativity, and heart. And Ethan, the mechanic who refused to give up, was ready to take it all the way. Months of hard work had passed, and the once abandoned ship was no longer just a rusty relic. The seafarer's pride, as it still quietly bore its old name, was beginning to show signs of life. Its engines were repaired, the hull strengthened, and the decks were sturdy and polished. What had once been a vessel rejected by everyone now glimmered with promise. And yet, for Ethan, the real work was only beginning. He spent every morning walking the length of the ship, inspecting every detail. The cabins were next on his list. Years of neglect had left them dark, damp, and unwelcoming. Wooden panels were warped, small leaks had damaged the floors, and the air carried the scent of salt and decay. Ethan rolled up his sleeves, grabbed his tools, and began the painstaking process of restoration. Each panel he replaced, each leak he sealed, and each cabin he cleaned brought him a sense of pride. Slowly, the rooms transformed from dark, unusable spaces into clean, functional quarters that could comfortably house crew members for long journeys. Ethan was not just fixing the ship. He was thinking about how it could sail faster, carry more cargo, and be safer than before. He adjusted the engine systems to increase efficiency, strengthened the hull to withstand rough seas, and reinforced the masts and rigging. He even installed a small workshop on the lower deck where repairs could be made at sea. Every change he made was carefully considered. He had learned through months of trial and error that a ship was more than just wood and metal. It was a living machine that needed balance, precision, and care. Word of Ethan's work spread throughout the town. People who had once laughed at him began to visit more often, bringing supplies, asking questions, or simply watching in awe. Some had become curious about what he could achieve. One afternoon, a group of young apprentices from a nearby technical school came to see the ship. They had heard of Ethan's reputation and wanted to learn from him. Ethan welcomed them warmly, showing them how he repaired engines, replaced boards, and improvised solutions with limited resources. The apprentices watched carefully, inspired by his dedication and creativity. Even as he taught others, Ethan faced new challenges. One day, while testing the engine's performance, a gear jammed, causing smoke to fill the engine room. Ethan quickly turned off the system, took a deep breath, and began diagnosing the problem. It took hours of careful inspection, disassembly, and adjustment to fix the gear and prevent similar issues in the future. He was exhausted by the time the task was complete, but he felt a sense of satisfaction. Each problem he solved made the ship stronger and his knowledge greater. As weeks turned into months, the ship began to attract attention beyond the town. Local shipping companies, which had once refused it, now expressed interest. One morning, a representative from a major port came to inspect the ship. They walked along the decks, examined the engines, and even tested the rigging. Ethan answered questions confidently, explaining the improvements he had made. By the end of the visit, the representative was clearly impressed. The ship, once rejected as worthless, was now a vessel of opportunity. Despite the growing attention, Ethan remained focused on the work rather than recognition. There were still smaller details to perfect. The paint needed touch-ups, the sails required careful repair, and the storage compartments had to be reorganized for maximum efficiency. Ethan spent hours making subtle improvements, ensuring that nothing was overlooked. Each adjustment made the ship more reliable and capable. One of the most rewarding moments came when the first successful engine test was completed. Ethan had spent weeks ensuring every part was working in harmony. When he finally started the engine, the sound was smooth and powerful, unlike the groaning and wheezing of the old, abandoned ship. The deck vibrated gently under his feet, and for a moment, Ethan closed his eyes and listened. The ship was alive again. He had breathed life into something everyone else had given up on. As the ship's transformation continued, Ethan also strengthened his bond with the townspeople. They began to see the value of perseverance and imagination. Some helped with repairs, bringing tools, wood, and other materials. Others offered advice or shared their own knowledge about shipping and navigation. Ethan welcomed every bit of help, knowing that even small contributions made a difference. The ship had become more than a project. It was a symbol of community effort and shared pride. Ethan's nights were filled with planning for the future. He studied maps, read books about long-distance shipping, and considered ways to improve safety and efficiency. He imagined the ship sailing across distant waters, enduring storms, and reaching ports far beyond the town. These dreams motivated him to keep going, even when fatigue set in. He knew that the ship's potential was limitless, but only if he continued to give it his best effort. One day, while working on the ship's bow, Ethan noticed a small leak in the hull. He immediately stopped his work, lowered himself into the area, and carefully examined the damage. The leak was minor, but if left unchecked, it could have caused serious problems during a voyage. Ethan spent hours repairing it, reinforcing the area with extra layers of metal and sealant. When he finished, he stood up, wiped sweat from his brow, and smiled. Each problem solved was a step closer to the ship's full potential. The ship's appearance also improved dramatically. Fresh coats of paint covered the rust, polished railings reflected the sunlight, and the decks shone with a warm glow. It looked strong, reliable, and ready to sail. People who once avoided the dock now stopped to admire it. Children ran along the dock, imagining adventures at sea, while adults nodded with respect at Ethan's work. The abandoned ship had been transformed into a vessel that inspired pride and hope. Ethan also focused on safety and navigation. He installed new ropes, reinforced the masts, and ensured the lifeboats were functional. He tested every system, often spending long hours running simulations and checking for potential problems. His attention to detail was meticulous. He knew that a single oversight could jeopardize everything. Each test he completed successfully made the ship more reliable and built his confidence for the day it would finally sail. Despite his hard work, Ethan remained humble. He didn't see himself as a hero or genius. He was simply someone who refused to give up on something that had been rejected. The ship had become an extension of himself, a reflection of his determination, creativity, and patience. Every plank replaced, every engine repaired, and every rope secured was a testament to his belief in possibilities. As news of the ship's transformation spread beyond the town, more people came to witness the progress. Engineers, sailors, and curious townspeople came to see the remarkable work. Many were impressed by Ethan's skill, ingenuity, and dedication. Some even asked him for advice on restoring other abandoned vessels. But Ethan remained focused on the seafarer's pride, determined to see it complete before taking on another project. One sunny afternoon, Ethan completed the final repairs on the main deck. He stood at the ship's helm, looking out at the horizon. The wind gently ruffled his hair and the sun warmed his face. He felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The abandoned ship had been transformed. It was no longer a symbol of failure or neglect. It was strong, capable, and ready to sail. It was a reflection of perseverance, creativity, and the power of one person's determination. Ethan invited the townspeople to witness the ship's first test journey. They gathered at the dock, curious and excited. Children held onto the railings, wide-eyed, while adults whispered to each other in amazement. As Ethan started the engines, the ship vibrated gently, then moved smoothly through the water. The townspeople cheered. The abandoned vessel, rejected by everyone, was now a living, functioning ship. It sailed confidently, cutting through the waves with strength and elegance. The sight was inspiring. People who had doubted, laughed, or ignored the ship now saw it in a new light. They realized that what had once seemed impossible could be achieved with skill, patience, and determination. Ethan's work had not only restored a ship, but also restored hope and belief in the impossible. Even after the successful test journey, Ethan continued to improve the ship. He made small adjustments, tested equipment, and ensured every detail was perfect. For him, the process was never about finishing quickly, it was about achieving excellence. And with every day that passed, the ship became more capable, more reliable, and more impressive. By the end of this phase, the seafarer's pride was no longer just a ship. It was a symbol of resilience, creativity, and the power of human effort. Ethan's dedication had turned something abandoned into something extraordinary. People in the town began to talk not just about the ship, but about Ethan, the mechanic who refused to give up, who saw potential where others saw waste, and who transformed the impossible into reality. Ethan looked at the ship one evening as the sun set. The water glimmered, and the wind whispered through the ropes and sails. He knew the final stage of the journey was approaching, the stage where the ship would sail fully restored, recognized, and admired beyond the town. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. He had taken the first steps to turn a forgotten vessel into the greatest it could be, and the results were undeniable. The sun rose over the quiet coastal town, casting a golden glow on the water and the dock where the seafarer's pride now rested. Unlike before, the ship no longer looked abandoned. Its hull gleamed, the decks were polished, and the rigging was tight and orderly. The engines hummed quietly, ready to carry the ship across the sea. Ethan stood on the deck, hands on the railing, looking out at the horizon. Months of tireless work, problem-solving, and determination had brought him to this moment. The ship, once rejected by everyone, was now ready to prove itself to the world. The town had been buzzing with excitement for weeks. People from nearby towns and ports had heard rumors of the ship's transformation and came to see it for themselves. Engineers, sailors, and even local officials visited to inspect the work. They walked along the deck, tested the engines, and examined the cabins. Each inspection ended with amazement. Many who had doubted Ethan at the start now nodded with respect, recognizing his talent, patience, and vision. Some even asked him for advice on restoring their own vessels. But Ethan remained focused on the ship itself, knowing that recognition would follow naturally once the ship sailed. The first official voyage was scheduled for early morning. Ethan worked through the night, making final adjustments. He checked the engines, tightened ropes, secured cargo spaces, and ensured that all safety equipment was in place. Every detail mattered. He could not afford even the smallest mistake. The stormy seas, changing winds, and the unpredictability of the ocean meant that a ship needed to be perfect before it could truly be trusted. As dawn approached, Ethan finally allowed himself a moment to rest and watch the sky lighten. The colors of morning reflected on the water, promising a new beginning. A small crowd gathered at the dock to witness the first voyage. Children ran to the railing, their eyes wide with excitement, imagining adventures across the sea. Adults whispered to each other, pointing out the improvements on the ship and nodding in approval. Even the local fishermen who had once ignored the abandoned vessel stood silently, watching with admiration. Ethan felt a surge of pride, but also a calm focus. Today was not about applause. It was about proving that the ship could sail safely, efficiently, and reliably. He began the voyage slowly, guiding the ship out of the dock with careful precision. The engines hummed smoothly, the ship gliding through the water like a living creature. Waves lapped against the hull, and the wind filled the sails, testing their strength. Ethan moved confidently across the deck, checking instruments, ropes, and engines. He could feel the ship responding to his care, every plank and bolt working in harmony. It was a moment of pure connection between human and machine. The journey was not without challenges. Midway through the first test, a strong gust of wind caused the ship to tilt sharply. Ethan quickly adjusted the sails, shifting weight and balancing the vessel. The crew he had assembled, volunteers and apprentices eager to learn, watched in awe as he managed the situation with calm precision. The ship, which had once been fragile and abandoned, now moved with power and resilience. The challenge reinforced the bond between Ethan and the vessel. He realized that all his months of preparation had paid off. The ship could withstand the sea's unpredictability, and he had prepared it well. As the ship sailed farther, Ethan reflected on the journey he had taken to this point. He thought about the early days when the vessel had been nothing more than a rusted, abandoned shell. The engine rooms were corroded, the decks were weak, and the cabins were dark and unusable. People had mocked him, doubted him, and warned him that the project was impossible. Yet he had persevered. Each challenge, from broken gears to leaks in the hull, had taught him patience, creativity, and resilience. The ship's transformation was not only a physical achievement, but a personal one, proving that dedication and belief could turn failure into success. Along the voyage, news of the ship's journey spread to nearby towns and ports. Messages were sent ahead, and by the time the ship reached the next harbor, a crowd had gathered. Ethan guided the ship safely to the dock, and the townspeople greeted it with applause. The ship's reputation had grown beyond the small coastal town where it had been abandoned. It was now a symbol of possibility, hope, and human ingenuity. Ethan also began mentoring young mechanics and apprentices during the voyage. He showed them how to maintain engines, check hull integrity, and manage navigation systems. The apprentices eagerly absorbed every lesson, learning not just technical skills, but also the values of persistence, careful observation, and problem-solving. Ethan realized that the ship's transformation was influencing more than just the vessel itself. It was inspiring a new generation of skilled, thoughtful mechanics who understood the power of patience and creativity. Despite the admiration and excitement, Ethan remained focused. The ship had proven itself capable, but he knew that ongoing maintenance and attention would be crucial. Every voyage required careful preparation, constant observation, and immediate responses to any issue. He meticulously documented each improvement, noting what worked well and what could be further refined. This attention to detail ensured that the ship would remain strong, safe, and reliable for years to come. One day, as the ship sailed near open waters, a sudden storm approached. Dark clouds gathered and the wind intensified. Waves rose high, crashing against the hull, testing the ship's strength. Ethan calmly directed the crew, adjusting the sails and securing cargo. The ship groaned and tilted, but it held firm. Each repaired plank, reinforced beam, and strengthened engine part worked exactly as Ethan had planned. Hours later, the storm passed, leaving the crew exhausted but unharmed. The ship had endured, proving its resilience and the effectiveness of Ethan's restoration work. The success of that journey cemented the ship's reputation. Word spread to major ports and shipping companies. Many who had once rejected the vessel now expressed interest in partnerships or contracts. Ethan had not only restored a ship, he had revived its potential for practical use, turning a discarded relic into a valuable asset. Yet, he remained humble. Recognition was satisfying, but his primary focus was always the work itself, the process of transforming something overlooked into something extraordinary. Back in the coastal town, the ship became a symbol of pride. Children played near the docks, pretending to sail across distant seas, while adults shared stories of Ethan's dedication and the ship's incredible journey from abandonment to greatness. Local schools invited him to speak to students about persistence, creativity, and problem-solving. He encouraged them to see potential where others saw waste, to never give up, and to believe in their abilities. The ship had become more than a vessel. It had become a lesson in determination and hope. Ethan also documented the ship's restoration and journeys. He created detailed logs of repairs, improvements, and solutions to challenges, forming a record that could be shared with others in the field. His notes, sketches, and photos became a guide for future restorations, ensuring that the lessons he had learned could benefit countless others. The ship, which had once been forgotten, was now contributing to the future of maritime restoration and engineering education. As the sun set over the harbor one evening, Ethan stood on the deck, looking out at the water. The sky was painted with shades of orange and pink, reflecting off the ship's polished hull. The gentle waves lapped against the sides, and the air carried the scent of salt and freedom. He thought about the journey, the months of hard work, the sleepless nights, the challenges overcome, and the victories earned. The abandoned ship had become something more than he had ever imagined. It was strong, capable, admired, and respected. It was living proof that perseverance, skill, and belief could transform the impossible into reality. Ethan reflected on his own growth. The journey had taught him patience, creativity, resilience, and leadership. He had learned to trust his instincts, to problem-solve under pressure, and to see value where others saw failure. These lessons were as important as any technical skill. They had shaped him as much as they had shaped the ship. The ship's legacy began to grow beyond the town. Shipping companies sought Ethan's guidance for other abandoned vessels. Young mechanics looked to him as a mentor. The story of a ship rejected by everyone, transformed by a single determined man, became a source of inspiration far and wide. People realized that greatness often lies hidden in overlooked places, waiting for someone willing to see its potential and invest effort, care, and skill. In the quiet moments, Ethan sometimes walked the ship alone, running his hands along the polished wood, feeling the hum of the engines, and listening to the waves against the hull. He felt a deep connection to the vessel, almost as if it were alive. Every plank, bolt, and rope carried the memory of his effort, patience, and creativity, and in return, the ship responded with strength, reliability, and grace. Finally, one bright morning, the seafarer's pride was ready for a long journey across the sea. Ethan, with a crew of apprentices and volunteers, guided the ship out of the harbor. Waves sparkled in the sunlight, gulls circled above, and townspeople cheered from the dock. The ship moved steadily, confidently, and smoothly through the water. It was no longer a vessel of neglect. It was a symbol of triumph, resilience, and vision realized. As the ship sailed into the horizon, Ethan stood at the helm, feeling the wind on his face and the power beneath his feet. The journey of restoration was complete, but its impact would last forever. The abandoned ship had been transformed into the greatest it could be, not by chance, but by a human mechanic who refused to give up. It had become a beacon of hope, determination, and the limitless possibilities that come from seeing potential where others see failure. The seafarer's pride continued to sail, carrying goods, inspiring others, and proving that with patience, skill, and heart, even the most forgotten and rejected things could achieve greatness. And Ethan, the man who believed when everyone else doubted, knew that the journey was worth every challenge, every sleepless night, and every drop of sweat. Together, man and ship had created something extraordinary, a story of transformation that would be remembered for generations.